When Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he carried with him diseases which all but wiped out the native Indian population. Their revenge, according to history, was to send back to Europe the scourge of syphilis, a disease so terrible it would become known as the Great Pox. For 500 years we blamed the American Indians for unleashing this plague upon the world. But now a skeleton unearthed in an English monastery is about to rewrite history. This is the story of how a construction project in Hull, England, uncovered a medieval mystery that would shatter 500 years of accepted history and reveal the shocking truth about one of humanity's deadliest diseases. Our story begins in the industrial city of Hull, on the northeast coast of England. When city planners decided to build a new magistrates' court next to a multi-storey car park, they gave the local archaeological unit a chance to survey the site first. Working within a very limited time frame, the team worked day and night, digging out what they suspected might be the remains of a medieval friary. By the end of the dig, they had unearthed more than 240 skeletons and countless artifacts, information which painted a detailed picture of a shadowy medieval world.
John Buglass, the project leader, knew this was special. We have the complete ground plan for a medieval monastery, which is almost unheard of. The preservation conditions are excellent. We have surviving coffins, textile fragments, leather objects. We even have bodies that still have shoes on.
But one skeleton in particular was set to rewrite history. Very soon after excavation, the team started seeing something unusual. There was a lot of infectious disease at the site, particularly what looked like classic cases of syphilis. This one, number 1216, a male aged 25 to 35, was the best example they had ever seen. The skeletons were sent to the University of Bradford for analysis, where an expert in paleopathology, the archaeology of disease, would examine them. Dr. Charlotte Roberts knew that it's usually incredibly difficult to diagnose the cause of death so long after the event, as many diseases leave no trace on bones. But syphilis is one of the few exceptions.
There are a number of changes in the skeleton for recognizing syphilis, Charlotte explains. If we focus on the skull, you can see immediately that there's something wrong. Normally, you would expect to see a smooth surface on this part of the skull. But here you've got pockmarked lesions, holes in the bone. It's something people call caries sicca. It's characteristic of venereal syphilis. You don't see it in any other disease. You've got a hole in the palate, the connection between the nose and the mouth. That's commonly seen in syphilis. If we move down the skeleton, what we see is bone formation and bone destruction. The most florid bone formation is actually on the leg bones. This is the thigh bone, and you can see the whole length has got formation of new bone. You also get massive bone formation on the front of the lower leg bone, which people call a saber shin, because it looks like a saber. Imagine the inflammation, the swelling of these limbs, the redness, the heat, the pain.
Apart from skeleton 1216, the site contained two more classic cases of the disease, and there were characteristic signs of syphilis in more than 60% of the bodies. but all these people were buried within the sanctuary walls of a deeply religious community. And syphilis is a venereal disease. It's contracted through sexual intercourse. So what kind of religious community was this? The building belonged to a Christian order called the Augustinian Friars. This complex of cloisters, living accommodation and church was one of the first friaries established in England. It lasted from its foundation until 1539, when it became the last to be destroyed. The brothers were not rich like some other religious orders. They were supposed to beg for a living. These friars were the social services of their day. They looked after the poor, were skilled in medicine, and cared for the sick, whether rich or poor. Their good works and religious calling put them beyond reproach. They were celebrated members of the community. But the evidence from the dig raised disturbing questions. A dozen bodies were found with wooden rods buried alongside them, leading to suspicion that these friars belonged to a flagellation sect.
We have a series of rods, which are quite short, still with bark on them, hazel, nice and whippy. There's been a suggestion these are actually flagellation rods. At this time, with plague sweeping through Europe, there was quite a strong movement for self-flagellation. You suffer more in this life, therefore the afterlife becomes better.
But the Augustinian brothers were also experts on the afterlife, and they made a lot of money from death. They sold candles and burial shrouds, presided over funerals, held vigils and set masses for souls of the departed, all paid for by the wealthy merchant and aristocratic classes, buying their way into heaven through the industry of the friars. This put the brothers in a powerful position, and the system was open to corruption. The friary was deliberately positioned in the commercial heart of town, wedged between houses of wealthy merchants and the bustling port. The trade coming into Hull was enormous, 1.5 million litres of wine per year from Spain alone. The site uncovered large collections of imported wine jugs, evidence that at least some of the carousing was going on within the friary walls. Channel 4 commissioned experts to make a computerized map plotting each skeleton on the outline of the friary. The most prestigious burial plots were reserved for senior friars and rich merchants who paid for the privilege. The map shows exactly where skeleton 1216 was buried, in a prime spot close to the altar. So which was he? A rich nobleman or an esteemed member of the monastic community? We will never know, but we do know when he died. The evidence from the dig suggests skeleton 1216 died in the 1300s. If this was true, this was electrifying information, because history records that syphilis originated amongst the Native American Indians and was contracted by the crew of Christopher Columbus during his voyages to the New World. On returning to the Old World, the new disease grew into a plague of epidemic proportions, first among the Spanish soldiers at the Siege of Naples in 1495, before spreading remorselessly through Europe. If the Hull site could be dated to before 1492, then the disease must have existed in the Old World prior to Columbus's journey. History would have to be rewritten. And to date the burials, the archaeologists at Hull had a rare piece of luck. The waterlogged conditions had preserved a remarkable number of wooden coffins, ideal material for getting a reliable date. Ian Tyers, from the Dendrochronology unit in Sheffield, took over 300 samples back to his lab.
The critical thing we were sorting out was the dating of the coffins themselves, Ian explains. You can see we have wide rings and narrow rings, effectively reflecting the conditions under which the tree was growing, whether it was having a good summer or a bad summer. Those act like a fingerprint through time.
Having recorded measurements for each sample, Ian fed all the information into a central database to find a match.
From our dating perspective, we can date the year and indeed the season that the trees were felled. Those that we have bark-edged, so the year the trees were cut down, are all in the 1340s and 1360s.
The date from the Dendrochronology lab puts the coffins between 1340 and 1369. This information sent shockwaves through the archaeological and historical world. Syphilis is not supposed to have been in Europe until Columbus brought the disease back from America, 150 years after skeleton 1216 was buried in Hull. But supporters of the Columbus theory wanted more. They wanted a date that came from the bones themselves. Charlotte sent samples to the carbon dating laboratory in Oxford. By working out how much radioactive carbon is left in the bones, it's possible to determine when the individual died. When the carbon age of 1216 was converted into calendar time, even with a cautious margin of error, the young man with syphilis definitely died between 1300 and 1420 AD, at least 70 years before Columbus set sail for the Americas. To understand why the Columbus theory was so deeply believed, we need to look at the reasons people have always blamed America for this terrible disease. In the closing years of the 15th century, a young scholar named Joseph Grunpeck described a new disease sweeping through Europe. In recent times, I've seen a disease which is so cruel, so distressing, so appalling, that until now nothing so horrifying, nothing more terrible or disgusting has ever known on this earth. Grunpeck was an eyewitness to the agonies of Spanish soldiers at the siege of Naples in 1495. Some had become so repugnant that, left in the open air on the battlefield, they hoped to die. Others moaned and wept because of the ulceration of their genitals. Grunpeck's description is historically important. It's the first unchallenged record of syphilis in the world. He accurately portrayed the distinct stages of the disease as they're still understood today. The first stage just involves ulceration at the site of infection. Things like genital ulcers, swelling of the glands, followed by an abscess from which putrid-smelling pus flowed for 4 months. The second stage, occurring 3 to 6 months after infection, brings a generalized rash. They experienced intense pains in head and bones, and soon boils appeared all over the body. It's the third phase where you get considerable ulceration on the skin. The person wouldn't be feeling too good and wouldn't look very nice either. You can relate the bone lesions quite nicely to illustrations of skin. Imagine a boil or ulcer on the skin tracking down to these lesions on the skull. Not very nice. If you've got an infectious lesion active in the mouth, you're going to have pretty awful bad breath. If you can imagine this person with these bones inside their body, you'd expect swelling, quite a lot of pain and heat from inflammation. The other thing you get in the third phase is what they call general paralysis of the insane. This was more than just another plague. It was a disease which brought not only pain but shame. In the fervently religious Christian Europe of the time, this new disease represented the wrath of God, punishing wicked people for their immorality. As Grunpeck describes the horror at the end of the 15th century, no one knew where syphilis came from, and nobody was willing to accept it as their own. He called it the French disease. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Germans called it the Spanish itch. Then, a Portuguese doctor who had treated Columbus's crew made the connection with their trip to the New World. Clearly, they had contracted the disease from dirty American Indian women and brought it back to Christian Europe. For 500 years since American Indians were first blamed, scientists have searched for evidence to support the Columbus theory. Dr. George Armalagos is absolutely convinced that Columbus's crew contracted the disease in the Americas. He's been analyzing skeletons for 30 years.
What I found is that there's all kinds of evidence of the lesions in the New World prior to Columbus, and it continues on after Columbus. I looked from Florida all the way up to Ohio, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and it was just incredible numbers of cases of this syphilis-like lesion.
George is convinced the disease was widespread in the New World because he's found signs of syphilis in populations as a whole, not just isolated cases. Charlotte is invited to an international conference in Texas where the world's leading experts are gathered. Armed with photographic evidence and a carbon date, she arranges a private meeting to confront George Armalagos.
I have some very interesting photographs of a skeleton from England that I think might change your mind about the pre-Columbian origin. You think facts are going to change my mind? I'm hoping so. This skeleton comes from Hull. It's one of 3 that has changes which we would consider classic for syphilis. Carries sicca, perforation of the palate, destruction and formation of bone. 60% of the adults have bone formation on the lower legs. I say this is obviously a clear case of syphilis.
When you see something like this, the whole specimen, which is classic, I really congratulate you because this is quite impressive. Any anatomist who had experience with syphilis in modern populations would recognize these lesions immediately.
On the face of it, Charlotte has scored a significant victory. Her diagnosis has been accepted, but George is still not convinced it's enough to overturn 500 years of history.
How many skeletons have been excavated in England, would you guess? Oh, many thousands. 50,000 plus. Well, your point is that even though 50,000 skeletons exist, they haven't been looked at systematically by a person trained to find syphilis. But this has been an issue since the late 1800s, even from the 1500s. This is such an important issue within the history of medicine, within the history of disease, within the history of the world, that it seems to me all of this evidence would be there by now.
Charlotte knows he has a point. For George, more classic cases would have to be unearthed before he would abandon the Columbus theory. But in Don Ortner, curator at the Smithsonian Institution, Charlotte has found an ally. Don has examined evidence in both the Old World and the New World.
And he has a crucial insight. There is only one indisputable way to diagnose syphilis in old bones. The best evidence for venereal syphilis is going to occur in children's skeletons, Don explains.
Syphilis is only infectious in the first stages. If a woman becomes pregnant during this time, the teeth forming in the unborn child will have a unique groove mark on them. You'll see evidence of abnormal defects in the teeth. You can see a groove that's horizontal going across the central incisor. The enamel was clearly very defective in formation, and this would have been right at the end of pregnancy or at the time of birth. The work in the New World cannot prove that the disease originated in America. Too little work has been done in Europe to conclusively reject the Columbus theory. Only a handful of child skeletons with the telltale syphilitic groove in their teeth, dated before 1492, had ever been found. All of them in America. In effect, the whole Columbus theory rested on 4 or 5 skeletons, and yet still it stood, apparently unshakable. That is, until another skeleton was found with the distinctive teeth to finally shatter this distorted view of history. A skeleton found not in America, nor in medieval Europe, but from a town that flourished 2,000 years before the death of skeleton 1216. Professors Mathieu and Renata Henneberg excavated nearly 300 skeletons from an ancient Greek settlement in southern Italy called Metaponto. Metaponto was a busy port of 40,000 inhabitants that flourished from 600 BC.
As they worked through the bones looking for signs of disease, Mathieu found it difficult to believe the evidence before his eyes. What I could see on the bones in terms of physical signs of disease was not making much sense in terms of patterns we normally expect in ancient populations, Mathieu recalls. It took me 2 weeks to come to grips with the idea that the signs fit only one disease, and this disease was syphilis.
He found many bones with the classic syphilis lesions and formations.
Then his wife Renata, a dental expert, found the clinching proof, a child skeleton with the telltale markings on its teeth. When I told him I have 2 examples of teeth changed as found in congenital syphilis, Mathieu was very happy because finally we had the picture of syphilis coming together.
The Hennebergs knew that if they were right, the presence of syphilis in Europe had nothing to do with Columbus. If it had been in Europe since classical times, they should also find evidence at their other archaeological site, the ancient Roman remains at Pompeii. They began to search for evidence that other experts might have missed. Crucially, they widened their search beyond what the bones alone could tell them. They read Latin texts and studied Roman medicine. They found evidence everywhere that convinced them syphilis was rampant in the city. There are various strands of evidence from written sources, from the cultural functioning of the city, from the business of prostitutes, from public houses, from the fact it was a trading center and seaport. Evidence we can see on bones all comes together to support the hypothesis of the presence of syphilis in the classical antiquity of Europe. By looking at the wider social context of the disease, the Hennebergs have not just demonstrated that syphilis has been in Europe for thousands of years, they've found the key to unlock the syphilis enigma. The question is no longer who gave it to whom. There simply isn't enough bone evidence yet on either side of the Atlantic to settle that argument for good. But add to the evidence of the bones an understanding of the way of life in these places, and the true story of syphilis begins to unfold. Syphilis is a survivor. And to survive, it has mutated to adapt to different climates and different societies. It has not always been a killer. Epidemiological research shows that in rural societies around the world, syphilis was present, but in a much milder form and was not transmitted sexually. Dr. Mary Lucas Powell studies the evolution of the bacteria and how it's been transmitted among Indian communities of the New World.
In the pre-Columbian New World, in the southeastern United States, there was ample opportunity because of styles of clothing, of communal sharing of eating and drinking utensils, of sleeping places. There were abundant opportunities in every generation for these diseases to be transmitted without any sexual contact involved.
What the syphilis bacteria needs is skin-to-skin contact. In unsophisticated rural communities and in hot climates like pre-Columbian America, the bacteria could easily pass from skin to skin. It caused an ugly skin disease that everyone caught in childhood. It rarely developed into something more serious, and everyone who caught it as a child was immunized against the dangerous venereal form. So why then does the bacteria sometimes mutate into a sexually transmitted killer? If we look at the places where we now know syphilis existed in its deadly venereal form, what links them? Metaponto, Pompeii, Hull, and Naples. The common denominator is that they were all ports. Complex international trading was an essential feature of life in these places.
You're going to have people from the Baltic, from Spain, from the Low Countries, the Dutch, the French, people from Poland. Because you've got high turnover population, disease is going to come in.
But there's another crucial reason. Venereal syphilis is primarily a disease of cities, of advanced civilizations with advanced health measures and medications. Civilization means better hygiene, the wearing of clothes, less sharing of eating and drinking utensils. This means the less dangerous form of the bacteria cannot move around as easily. It must mutate to survive. The people buried within the Hull Friary walls were the sophisticated urban elite of medieval society. Among such people, the mild form simply couldn't survive, so the syphilis bacteria sought out the warm sexual parts of the body and waited. The syphilis enigma is finally cracked. The bacteria has been in human society for thousands of years, but like all bacteria, it is not fixed in a single form. As society has changed, so it has changed. Where climate and social customs permitted, it would thrive as a mild childhood skin disease. But whenever and wherever social change made that impossible, it has mutated into a terrifying sexually transmitted killer. But there is a final cruel twist in the tale for the innocent American Indians, tainted for 500 years by the accusation that they gave syphilis to the world. When they first encountered Columbus and his crew, they were almost wiped out by the diseases the Europeans carried: smallpox, measles, typhus. The Indians survived, but with the loss of so many people, they also lost their immunity to syphilis, the cycle of protection given to each generation by the existence of the non-venereal form had been broken. And when, in subsequent centuries, venereal syphilis came in from the Old World, the result on the Native American populations was as devastating as it had been on the Europeans hundreds of years earlier. The story of syphilis is not about who gave what to whom. It's about how human civilization itself creates the conditions for diseases to evolve and spread. And that's a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in medieval Hull, ancient Pompeii, or Columbus's America.